Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. As it was mentioned, it's over 7 years when I have the privilege to welcome you here at the premises of the Czech National Bank and open this forecasting dinner with some thoughts on forecasting and related issues. Unsurprisingly, tonight it won't be any different. And again, I will start with a short opening speech. Nevertheless, those of you who were expecting exact inflation and GDP growth numbers, I will kindly ask you to refer to our latest report that was published last Friday. As it is almost certain that this is my last chance to speak to such a distinguished audience still as the governor of the Czech National Bank, I would like to use this opportunity and to discuss the forecasting process in the Czech National Bank from a little bit broader perspective. As many of you well know, it's generally recognized that central bank policies must be forward-looking. As emphasized by Milton Friedman, for example, there are long lags between the monetary policy actions and their impact on the economy. In this tradition, Alan Greenspan, for instance, when being the chairman of the US Federal Reserve System, pointed out, let me quote him, "Too often in the past, policymakers responded late to unfolding economic developments and found they were behind the curve. Those who wish for us to evade clearly visible signs of emerging inflation before acting are recommending we return to a failed regime of monetary policy that costs jobs and living standards. I wish it were otherwise, but there is no alternative to basing policy on what are unavoidable, uncertain forecasts." So that's Alan Greenspan. So forecast, this is a keystone for a monetary policy framework. It means inflation targeting, yet practical forecasting is pretty far from being an easy job. The rule number one is in this business is that whereas a failure in the stochastic part of the forecast is still something you can live with, a failure in forecasting trend changes can cause enormous inaccuracy of the forecast. Then consequently, forecasting techniques don't necessarily have to match for any short-term movement. However, they should not fail when breakpoints in the economy are under consideration. As a good example of the above point serves our, that means Bank Board of the Czech National Bank decision to cut interest rates in August 2008, when there was no visible sign of any recession among the European countries. Inflation was above our inflation target because of oil and food prices, and the European Central Bank raised its interest rate only months before. Although it's certain that at the time actual forecast didn't match the data perfectly, with no doubt it identified the breakpoint and by that served very well its purpose. Naturally, the forecast accuracy, it means the ability to identify breaking points reasonably well, has not come out of the blue sky. The actual way in which forecasts are produced and used in central banks has changed substantially over the past 2 decades. These changes have reflected developments both in the economic and econometric theory and also in monetary policy regimes. Bearing in mind the failure of large-scale models in the 70s, the profession has started to prefer small-scale models with a sounder microeconomic background, built in recent decades, usually along the lines of new Keynesian economics. Well, maybe we are still not able to match all statistical numbers perfectly, but I hope that we are more skilled in recognizing important breaks in the development of our economies than we were 10 years ago. Indeed, the use of general equal models forces us to think about the economy in a consistent way, and the use of multivariate filters has improved our knowledge about the current position of the economy in the business cycle. You probably all remember that inflation targeting was, in our case, introduced in a challenging situation after a period of currency turmoil in May 1997, which ended the fixed exchange rate period and resulted in high inflation and rising inflation expectations. And still, there are some people who would remember that period quite well. For instance, Luděk Niedermayer, my former colleague from the board. The economy needed a new nominal anchor in order to return to this inflation path. Inflation targeting was chosen as the best of all bad alternatives at that time. Such a sudden switch from a fixed exchange rate system to inflation targeting required a radical and fast change in the central bank's mentality. This was perhaps the biggest challenge that the Czech National Bank had to face. Over the past 5 years, It has involved much work on improving our forecasting tools, leading to substantial development in our internal analytical processes. And then, at the beginning of 2002, the Czech National Bank settled on a new forecasting process. This integrates expert judgment and short-term analysis, which were the key pillars of the CNB's forecasting toolkit in the first year of inflation targeting, with a macroeconomic model that provides a consistent framework for the policy analysis. An important element of this step was a switch from a forecast with a fixed exchange rate assumption to the so-called unconditional forecast that includes a reaction function of the central bank. The initially established quarterly projection model was a small-scale model belonging to the second generation of such models. It was thus relatively simple and arguably missed many important links in the economy. Nevertheless, it was already quite close to the state-of-the-art among the inflation targeting central banks around the world, and intense work has been in progress to build a higher generation model. As a result, from July 2008, the Czech National Bank's forecast is based on latest general equilibrium model, which is fully based on micro specifications. Of course, expert judgment and short-term analysis still play an important supplementary role in the design of the final forecast. It's worth mentioning that the development of our forecasting system has been part of the wider evolutionary process that the Czech inflation targeting regime has gone through. The first years of the new regime were not easy, included frequent numerical target misses. Nevertheless, the Czech Republic enjoys low inflation, and inflation expectations seem to be firmly anchored at low levels at present. Monetary policy decision-making is rule-based and transparent, thereby enhancing the credibility of the Czech National Bank. Let me conclude with the statement that the forecast-based monetary policy framework seems to be fully allow an independent central bank to commit credibly to its long-term goal of price stability, and this certainly means a lot. Thank you very much for the attention and enjoy the evening in the premises of the Czech National Bank. Thank you.